of FGM in Liberia. And from a UN standpoint, it's, I guess, obviously important to remember that we have international agreements against female genital mutilation, and therefore it is important to work towards the elimination of any harmful practice on women and girls. We've also discussed a lot that this country has an upcoming election, and I've already learned that in Nigeria you prepare early because the elections are next year. But we know that there is a discussion in Parliament around the proposal on quotas to support women candidates in elections, which is, we know, again, important to steer. We know that when you have quotas in legislation, that really does promote women's participation, both in elections, well, before elections, during elections, and also afterwards. We have also discussed the fact that Liberia has a very strong women's movement and women's organizations. And that, from a UN standpoint, we also know that that is a recipe for advancement because women's organizations take on a big responsibility to support women, defend women, advocate for women's rights, and to monitor whether those rights are implemented or not. We have also interacted with one peace hut and the women there, and which reminded us obviously of women's extremely important role during the civil war in peace and the peace process and the peace agreement, and the fact that they are still working in communities to sustain peace, which Liberia is actually world famous for. So there is a lot, I think, to really build on when it comes to gender equality and women's rights and women's organizations and leadership in the political leadership and engagement in the country. We've also seen some areas of improvement in terms of implementation of rights and women's situation, as well as challenges. And I'm thinking, of course, of the poverty rates, which are true for both women and men, but we know that women are always affected differently than men, since women normally have the lowest incomes and also less possibilities to change their lives because they have less space, less power, and again, less of their own income. We've also heard of climate change in Liberia, which mostly comes in form of floodings, which in its turn causes less access to land. And I understand that in Liberia, as in many other countries, women would work in agriculture and they would farm, but not own land to the same extent as men. And that is always very problematic. And we see more and more of that over the whole world as a consequence of climate change. We have also, and I understand there is also some migration over borders in relation to this issue, and I know that the UN also pays a lot of attention to that. We know that also violence is an issue in Liberia from men towards women, as in all countries. And we just now, today, this afternoon, visited something called a Spotlight initiative. And Spotlight is a program from the European Union together with the United Nations to try, together with governments, women's organizations, other actors such as traditional leaders, community leaders, and women themselves to prevent the violence, to protect women, and to also work with attitudes which enable violence against women. My last point is also obviously again the need for women as well as for men to have livelihoods which lead to income. And also when we went to Todi to visit the Spotlight Initiative today, we saw how important livelihoods are, that the women in this particular case are farmers and want to expand their business and then need to have access to markets. So they talked about better transport, better roads, all of this, which is important for both women and men, but again, women often have less of margins economically, and therefore the UN wants and the EU wants to, in this case, support women in all of this. So I'm very humbled to have seen the work both from the government, from my colleagues here, and from civil society, and people themselves in Liberia. It's been a very important experience and visit to me, and UN Women as well as the UN stand ready to support the Liberian leadership in their priorities for a better world for women and girls. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erasa. My fellow journalists, we will take a few questions. She's been here for 2 days, and she's visited several places. We went to Todi today. No. Okay. So, she met with government officials and civil society, and so you're free to ask questions about her visit, what she thought, but just keep it simple and pointed. Okay, thank you. So. First question?
Yeah. All right. My name is Yubiri Masale. I report for Sky and Sky Television. Madam, you said in your deliberation that this is your first time coming to Liberia, and you stress now issues affecting women. I want to know what specific message that you brought from your home or America to
New York.
The message I brought from New York?
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I work in New York is because the UN headquarters is there. And the message from the whole of the UN to the countries is obviously that we need to work harder when it comes to women's rights and gender equality. The world has set up goals for gender equality in order to support women's and girls' rights. But in fact, no country has reached those goals. All countries need to do more. They need to do more in terms of systems, structures in place, let's say, reforms, legislation, and also resources. So that would be my general message, because we know that is true for all countries, but then it is important for the UN to know the exact situation in the countries, which the resident coordinator is an expert on, and my colleagues in the region and in the country, so that the government and the UN can tailor interventions for that particular country to help reach those goals.
Good evening. Let me first say welcome to Liberia. I hope you have enjoyed your stay so far. My name is Rita Jowedu. I correspond for the Voice of America. So my question, as we all know, women play a pivotal role in sustaining peace in Liberia, especially stabilizing the country and the integrity institutions. Yet then still women are unrepresented politically. What is UN Women doing to address this issue? Is there a specific roadmap that you have to address this issue? Second place, despite the alternative economic livelihood provided in Todi to abolish or reduce the practice of FGM, report has said that the practice is still ongoing. What is your women doing to sustain the alternative livelihood in those areas? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take a minute?
Very happy to come
Yes,
out.
you start from
Yes, okay, we'll do that, okay. Yes, absolutely. When it comes to women's role in peace building, as I said, Liberia is actually world famous for women's role in peace building. And they were also a party to the peace agreement, and as you know, had very important female political leaderships, the first president in Africa, now, as you say, it seems to me that it is very important to use this fantastic resource that this country has, these networks and this experience to sustain peace in the country and also, I guess, connect different parts of the country with the women with that peace experience. Because many times issues like violence against women are very connected with other kinds of violence. I think also that, again, Liberia has an important role in the region to play, since it is a peaceful country when many other countries close by have a much more unstable situation. UN Women is supporting the peace huts, and it is our role also to support, when possible, this interaction between women with that peace experience with other women, but also with men in the country to help build those bridges all over the country. I think also women's participation in elections are really important, we know that. And for example, right now we have colleagues in North region to support not any political party, obviously, or individual candidates, but women's participation in that particular election, and will continue doing so to work with political parties leading up to the general elections. And we've also had very interesting discussions with the government and individual ministers on about how to support women's participation in these elections, how to prevent violence and threats against women candidates, which is a common problem in most countries, and which sometimes actually deters women from continuing to run, perhaps, or they drop out from their post afterwards. So UN Women has initiatives and cooperation with both the government and political parties, and with the women's movement on that. And the issue of FGM, and I'm happy also to have comments from my colleagues here, because that's a very big problem, and it is obviously a violation of girls' rights. And as I said, that is also there are international agreements against harmful practices which violate women's and girls' rights. We know that when it comes to changing these kinds of harmful practices, and when it comes to changing power structures, and to really create change in this perspective, it does take time, and it is important to understand what the harmful practice actually means in order to address how it can be changed. And UN Women is working on this together with other UN agencies. The resident coordinator knows much more about the whole work of the UN on this, but it is a big and important issue for us. And we work, as I said again, with women themselves. We work with traditional leaders. We met today, for example, with the Minister of Interior or Internal Affairs, who is responsible for the National Council for Traditional Leaders, who is also in dialogue with them on this. So you have to do many things at the same time. But also, obviously, I think the that now that the government has pronounced a suspension time, it's important to address this as a harmful practice and to follow up that the suspension is actually being to monitor the suspension that is actually implemented. Resident Coordinator, would you like to say something?
I would just like to add something on the women political participation. So our about what is UN Women doing about the quota? I think that the question would be, what are we all doing about the quota? I think if we want to move the needle, we will need government, of course, with political will. We will need political parties. We will also need you, the media, to help. In the whole region of West and Central Africa, there's some form of quota. Myself, I am from Senegal, and Senegal has parity in parliament and local government since 2012. So we know it's possible. The women that we met yesterday, the civil society organization, and even members of government, are confident that the 30% minimum quota will be upheld. We even heard that some of the parties are looking into 40 and 50%. So we need to drive the momentum together as a coalition of the willing, but I think the women of Liberia deserve to have a seat at the table. And the quota, which we call the temporary exceptional measures, will help us, all of us, make that big jump into gender equality and women empowerment. Thank you.
So I also asked about the sustainability of those alternative livelihoods. As we all know, the people sustain themselves from those monies people pay to send their children in the Sunday education. So to abolish such things, I believe you should have sustainability plan of those alternative livelihoods. So what are you doing to sustain the projects you have?
Yeah, that is what we visited today, but I think the resident coordinator has a lot of experience also from other work that we do.
Well, thank you very much, and I perhaps just begin by thanking you for your patience, firstly. Secondly, saying we're very privileged to have a very senior UN official visit Liberia from the United Nations headquarters. In this case, UN Women, but the fact that it's UN Women emphasizes the importance of women empowerment and gender equality. I'm very pleased to see in this room we achieved a good degree of gender equality. Let that be extended across the whole country. The question about the sustainability, the economic opportunities that, and it's mainly in this case, women would have. We saw today at first hand, I believe the Assistant Secretary General was referring to saying, this very powerful approach to the issue of FGM, and I think you all agree, FGM requires a very strong effort. It's the 3-year moratorium on FGM needs to be extended. It needs to be a platform to move towards the total eradication. However, there are socioeconomic factors involved, you're absolutely right. And today we saw a very good example of how we could offer alternatives, or alternatives rather could be offered to the Sandy schools, which provided girls with opportunities to learn traditional cultural knowledge, but which does not involve painful and unacceptable practices. At the same time, there was economic opportunity for the parents. In this case, we saw it at first hand, and it was very impressive. There was agricultural opportunity, and actually, good agricultural practice. Very impressed by the way production was done. That's one part of it. I actually must say I still seem to have an example of the potato plantation, but also through crafts, through weaving, through soap production. So there we have it. We have this dual approach, which emphasizes alternatives to harmful practices, which are absolutely necessary, combined with the provision of economic opportunity, which points to the future. For us, we were very impressed. We were impressed, I believe, I think my colleagues would agree, with the willingness shown by chiefs and elders to move the needle in eradicating FGM. We were impressed by the willingness of the population, especially the mothers, to see a better life for their daughters and their sons by engaging fully in the activities. And our hope at this point would be that we can take this very good example we saw today and replicate it. And we can move forward. But on the basis, and I commend you and women absolutely for supporting the government and the National Council of Elders. And I commend the Spotlight Initiative because it is making a difference. But I would say one last thing, in perhaps in conclusion. We have moved from not so long ago where it was quite difficult to discuss the topic of female genital mutilation to a situation now where we are considering it rationally and we're looking at solutions. And actually we're able to put those solutions into effect. So it's encouraging, a long way to go, absolutely. A long way to go, but we're certainly moving in that direction.
Thank you, Resident Gordon. Can I just also add that this afternoon we also interacted with men who support and show solidarity with women in this program, which I understand has been extremely important and will be going forward. And I think that to address men in relation to gender equality in general is really important, but it certainly is on the issue of female genital.
Okay, my name is Orita Bono. I'm with ECOWAS Radio. Yomi is working in more than one communities in Monserrado. So I want to know why your focus on your visits only focus to Tony. Why your visit only Tony? Why only visited to these functions?
Thank you. If I understood you correctly, why am I here such a short time? No.
Why? Why you only visited Sodi?
Todi. So why that particular? I thought you said 2 days. Sorry about that. Why that particular area? Since I came, I have heard, and I'm very respectful of the fact that this is the rainy season and it is difficult to reach many parts of Liberia, which seems to be a big problem and something that also that the officials are very aware of and want to do something to solve, although that will take time. So we traveled, I would say, on a very complicated journey, although from Monrovia in the same part of the country. But I think during my visit, this was more or less as far as we could come. And also, this is an important initiative that the Spotlight Initiative, UN, the European Union together are doing. And I understand also from the women who received us that they said that it is very important for them to receive visitors because although it is geographically not that far from Monrovia. It is complicated to get there, and they feel they really need or they want that interaction, just as we did. We wanted to get to know them and their work, and they feel it's important to have that dialogue with us. So that is one reason for going to that particular site, and I'm really happy we did. It was very nice.
My name is Tina S. Minton. I report for Liberia Observer newspaper. In Liberia, we don't have any law that compels a political party to present 50% women, 50% men. So ahead of the 2023 presidential election, what is UN Women doing to work with these political parties to compel them to present 50% women, 50% men?
Thank you very much. As I said earlier, we know that when countries have quota legislation in place, that really helps. It does change the political landscape and women's participation. Also, when women come into power, the political agenda and allocation of resources also changes. We know that through research globally. So we do engage with the government. We try to support the different models for these kinds of legislation, and it's obviously the country itself that should find the model that is best for the country in question. But our role is to support and is also to, in different ways, both support women's participation through quotas, for example, but it can also be in other ways. For example, to give advice on how to prevent electoral violence against women, which is a problem almost all over the world, but it plays out differently. There are also different ways of doing this. In my home country, which is Sweden, we have a long history of 50-50 women in parliament and in cabinet. In that country, it was actually journalists and the women's movement that put pressure on political parties, so to speak, named and shamed them when they did not have equally men and women on the lists. And in that country, that functioned. So my home country is famous for high levels of women's participation, but we have no quota laws because that functioned in that country. Other countries have to find their tools and means. And what we see from UN Women is that quota legislation really helps and changes, as I said, the political logic around women's participation.
If I can get the microphone.
Yes.
If I may, I think your question is extremely good on women's political participation. One other aspect to it, we were the other day in Bangor to speak to women who are involved in politics at the local level, at the county level. And it's extremely impressive. And I think this is also, now we're tending to focus at the House of Representatives and senatorial level because it's great. But we shouldn't underestimate the build-up of talent, extremely effective women's participation in politics at the levels which are in the sense of underpinning the legislature here. I also believe that one thing I think is possibly worth noting is that women we speak to, certainly within the political sphere, appear to be able to work across parties. And the Women's Political Caucus at the legislature is a very, very good example of where, obvious political differences exist, otherwise there wouldn't be several political parties. Those differences are able to be put to one side so that women can cooperate. And I think further cooperation in developing strategies to strengthen their presence in the elections will only be for the benefit. I mean, today we had a by-election, as we know. There were 6 candidates, 1 woman, which, is fine. It's not the proportion at all that we would like to see. But the main point, I think, is to make sure that women are able to present themselves on an equal footing with their male counterparts in elections, have the same support, have the same capacity, have the same resources. And that's something which, within the bounds of impartiality, neutrality, we would like to support. So we hope that we'll be able to move forward. But also, sorry, I think it's a very important topic, so I'll make one last comment. Introduce quotas, which is, you might as well name them, the CDC, the ANC, and the Liberty Party, who have introduced quotas of between 30 and 50% for women candidates. Let's see the rest of the parties follow suit, and let's make sure by 2023 that bit of legislation we'd all like to see enacted is in fact written into law, or the revision is written into law.
We'll take 2 more questions. We'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Darius. I'm a report for OKS. Thank you, Madam, for your deliberation. Now you highlighted on serious issue. My main point is that in Liberia, we're looking at the issue of sexual gender-based violence. In our country, it's on the round there. Now, our girls and sisters in school are being abused because of the economic challenges in our country. What did the UN women are doing to see how best to work with other women organizations to enhance this situation? Thank you.
So maybe it's a good idea to introduce Constantine, who is the head of the UN Women in Liberia. And the question was about abuse of young girls in schools, for example, and what we do against that sexual violence. Did I understand it correctly? Yeah. Yes. What do we do about that in Liberia?
Hi. So I think as a UN system, the best intervention that we have in working to address issues of gender-based violence or sexual abuse currently is the Spotlight Initiative, and that brings together 5 UN entities in Liberia. UN Women being one, but we also have UNICEF and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNDP, and UNFPA. And as you know, with the UN, we, depending on our mandates, we work with specific sectors and groups. So when it comes to working with children in particular, UNICEF takes the lead and we support that. And as part of Spotlight, UNICEF is actually doing quite a bit of work with schools and educating schools, young girls in schools, a lot of empowerment programs. So there's a lot that is going on. UNICEF is leading on the work in schools to both prevent and educate against sexual and gender-based violence. But I think generally and more broadly, we work together to ensure that issues of gender-based violence are addressed, and certainly as UN Women, we work very closely with the Ministry of Justice. I think Madam Regner, during her visit here yesterday, we did visit the Ministry of Justice, and we talked to them extensively, including with the units and officers, the directors that are working with gender-based violence within the ministry. We've been working very closely with that ministry to ensure that we can support some of the work that they're doing to address gender-based violence, not specifically for the school system, but more broadly. So those are some of the ways in which we work individually or collectively with our partners to address this problem.
Final question. You guys are good?
Yes.
Let me just make sure that anybody else who hasn't spoken. Okay.
Okay, I'm Asaledi, and you talk about the climate change, and you said in a word there are a lot of women that do not have land, and I want to know what you and women are doing to be able to get land for other women across the world. So, I want to also talk about the rape issue. In Liberia, we have a lot of rape going out in this country. So I want to know what you are doing to see how best people can stop raping women.
Thank you. Those are two big and very important questions. On a global level, and I think you asked about that on climate change, in fact, just 2 months ago, there was a big agreement on New York level about women's rights in the context of climate change. And the important thing with that agreement was that it didn't exist before, because in a way, climate change is quite a new issue, although it is a very current phenomenon and problem, for example, in Liberia. But we didn't have women's rights in the context of climate change like that before. But now we do. There was a negotiation in New York in March. So an important task for UN Women globally and in the countries is to have a dialogue with governments. Now you agreed to these points in this agreement on climate change and women's rights. So how can we help you to implement that? What do you think yourself is important to change in your country so to live up to these agreements? And that can, for example, be about women's access to land, which is an important issue in all countries almost. In Liberia, we have worked for several years with women in agriculture, also in the context of climate change. So maybe Ollie and Comfort can say something more specific about that experience. And I think also on the issue of sexual violence, that is one of the greatest problems, I would say, that hampers women in the world, and also is also a big problem in Liberia. And I think that Comfort alluded to some of the initiatives that UN Women takes. The Spot-Up initiative that we spoke about, which is an important one in terms of resources and structures, is one initiative to address all forms of violence against women, also sexual violence. But Comfort, perhaps you can go into more detail what they're doing.
So on rape, I think you're absolutely right. I think sadly the issue of rape in Liberia since the war has remained high, and many of you know that many organizations, women's rights organizations, and the U.S. system also supported the push to get the rape law passed. But I think the work around the establishment of criminal court E to help try or fast track trials for prosecution of rape cases. So some of the mechanisms have been put in place, but we see that the incidences of rape remains high, and I think there are many ways in which we have been supporting the government and also working in partnership with other organizations to address the issue of gender-based violence. Certainly, I think prevention is one of the big areas of investment that we have and will continue to, and certainly for us as UN Women, we do place a strong emphasis on prevention and also the role of men and boys, working with men and boys to really educate them around the need
to respect the rights of women. And of course, we also believe that when there are more prosecutions, that can also serve as a deterrent. But when people commit these crimes and they are not tried, or they negotiate and then they're let loose. So there are very many interventions, and we continue to support. We work very closely, as you know, with the Ministry of Gender and support them in some of this work. We also work through many of the civil society organizations that UN Women supports to try to respond to this. But I think that it's really an issue that requires collective engagement. I think you as the media have a really important role to play as well, just in terms of how you report on some of these cases and to keep it and follow some of these cases. You know, not that somebody has been raped and then we report it, but don't follow through in terms of what is happening around. Has that person been arrested? Is there been a prosecution, and so on? So I think we all have a role to play. Rapists, and we also have to continue to invest in which we do as UN Women, in women's organizations, women's human rights defenders, to support them, to also lead some of the work in the advocacy to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. But certainly, it is a national concern, I believe, and we will continue through the programs that we have, Spotlight and others, to try to ensure that we keep attention and support to both victims, people who are victimized, but very, very importantly, to support processes to prevent rape from happening in the first place.
Thank you very much. They also will make some closing comments, and then we'll close it up.
Yes, thank you so much for your interest and for your support to gender equality. We need to close up because we have another meeting. I think what I would like to say is that, as I said, Liberia is world famous for women's contribution to peace, as that we have discussed here. And I think that Liberia really is an interesting example. And I think can also serve as an interesting example in the region and in the world today. I think also that those women who do uphold peace and are important parts of sustaining peace themselves have expressed needs, for example, for livelihoods and for better life situations. And that, I think, is an important issue to take into consideration, and to both support these women, to connect women's organizations with each other, and to remember this fantastic track record in Liberia, and for us to always use that as a good example in the world, because the world is in a bad place when it comes to armed conflict, and we need good examples. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the UN team, I would just like to thank you for your patience, and I'm so proud to see real gender equity in the media. This is really good. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I promise you I'll make it up to you.
Hey, Madam,